Mom, you're embarrassing me. Leave now. The words cut through the air like a blade, sharper than any wound I had ever felt in my life. My son Marcus stood in front of me, his face twisted with anger and shame, his voice loud enough for the entire wedding hall to hear. For a moment, I thought I must have misheard him. I blinked, my body frozen in place, as if the world itself had stopped moving. But no, the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, some wide with shock, others curling with judgmental smirks. I looked down at myself at the simple blue dress I had worn. It wasn't new, it wasn't elegant, but it was clean and neat. It was all I could afford, and I had chosen it with care, hoping not to outshine the bride, yet still look presentable for my son's big day. But apparently for Marcus, my own child, it was not enough. I felt the ground beneath me tremble as the whispers started. "Why is she even here?" someone muttered. Another voice snickered, "Can't believe his mother showed up like that." Each comment stabbed deeper into my chest. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to tell him how proud I was, just to see him standing there in his tuxedo ready to start his new life. But my throat closed tight, the words strangled before they could escape. My son's glare only grew colder. I said, "Leave." He barked again, pointing toward the exit. My hands shook as I clutched the small purse against my side, the only thing anchoring me from collapsing right there on the floor. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had never imagined, not in my worst nightmares, that the boy I had raised with every ounce of my love and sacrifice would humiliate me in front of strangers. I lowered my head, feeling tears sting my eyes, and forced my trembling legs to move. Each step toward the door echoed like a funeral bell. In that moment, I wasn't a proud mother of the groom. I was an outcast, discarded by the very person I had given everything for. My name is Gloria Johnson, and I am 58 years old. I never thought I would one day stand in a room full of people and be told by my own son that I wasn't good enough to be there. But before I explain how things reached that moment, I need you to understand who I am and what I have lived through. I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. Life was never easy for me. My parents worked blue-collar jobs and money was always scarce, but they taught me the value of hard work and dignity. I carried those lessons into adulthood, even when life tested me in the cruelest of ways. At 26, I married my high school sweetheart, David Johnson. He was kind, funny, and he had dreams bigger than our small town could hold. We didn't have much, but we had each other. When Marcus was born a few years later, I felt as though God had handed me the greatest gift imaginable. My husband adored him, and I threw myself into motherhood with a devotion I had never known before. But fate wasn't kind. David passed away suddenly from a heart attack when Marcus was only 10 years old. That day, my world crumbled. I had lost my partner, the father of my child, and the stability of a two-income household. With nothing but grief in my chest and bills piling on the kitchen counter, I knew I had no choice but to step up and fight for my boy's future. I became a nurse's aide and eventually worked my way into a full-time nursing position. Those years were brutal. 12-hour shifts at the hospital, back-to-back doubles, when someone called in sick, and nights where I barely got 3 hours of sleep. My body ached constantly, but I kept pushing. Every paycheck was carefully divided: rent, groceries, school supplies, and a little set aside for Marcus's college fund. If I needed new clothes, I went without. If I dreamed of a vacation, I buried the thought. Everything I did was for my son. Marcus was my pride and joy. I attended every school event, cheered at his basketball games, and clapped the loudest at his high school graduation. I still remember the tears streaming down my face when he walked across that stage, diploma in hand. All those years of sacrifice felt worth it in that moment. I made sure Marcus went to college without drowning in debt. I worked double shifts, picked up extra shifts on holidays when other nurses wanted time with their families, just so my boy could have opportunities I never dreamed of. When he called me from campus, excited about his classes and new friends, my exhaustion melted away. His happiness fueled me. But as the years passed, I began to notice a distance forming between us. The sweet boy who used to hug me tight and whisper, "Thank you, Mom," after every home-cooked meal, grew into a man who sometimes forgot to call on my birthday. I brushed it off, telling myself he was just busy building his own life. That's what I wanted for him after all. When Marcus told me he was engaged to a young woman named Rebecca, I was thrilled. He sounded so happy, and that was all I cared about. He described her as beautiful, sophisticated, from a well-to-do family. I wanted to love her simply because she made my son smile. But the first time we met, I sensed the tension immediately. Her eyes swept over me, lingering on my plain clothes and worn shoes, and in that brief glance, I felt judged. Still, I swallowed my discomfort. I reminded myself that appearances didn't matter. What mattered was that Marcus had found someone to share his life with. I promised myself I would do everything I could to support their future together. I didn't know then that my love and loyalty would one day be repaid with humiliation, that the sacrifices I made for decades would be forgotten in the blink of an eye. At first, I tried to believe that Rebecca's sharp looks and dismissive tone were just nerves. After all, planning a wedding can overwhelm anyone. But as the months passed, it became clearer that her disdain for me wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. She never said it outright, but her words carried an edge that cut deep. "Marcus, maybe your mom should just sit this one out," she once suggested, while we were choosing flower arrangements. "She doesn't really understand this kind of thing." Her voice was sweet as sugar, but her eyes flicked toward me with unmistakable condescension. Marcus laughed nervously, not defending me, not even glancing in my direction. That was the first time I felt the sting of being excluded. Soon it became a pattern. Decisions about the wedding, the venue, the menu, the guest list were made without me. I wasn't consulted, and when I tried to offer suggestions, Rebecca would smile tightly and say, "That's sweet, but we're going for something more modern." Even the dress I should wear for the wedding was a matter of debate. Rebecca sent me pictures of expensive gowns, none of which I could afford. When I gently explained that my budget was tight, she sighed and said, "Well, I just don't want anyone to feel out of place, especially with the photos. This wedding will be everywhere online." Her implication was clear. If I showed up in something less than glamorous, I would embarrass her. Marcus, once my little boy who used to cling to my hand, began echoing her concerns. "Mom, just try to make an effort, okay? This day is really important to me." I swallowed my pride, nodded, and promised I would look my best. He didn't know that his effort meant I skipped meals and clipped coupons to afford even a modest dress. Still, my presence seemed more and more unwanted. At a family dinner with Rebecca's parents, I was the only one who wasn't poured wine. When I asked for a glass, Rebecca's mother laughed softly and said, "Oh, I just assumed you wouldn't be comfortable with it." The table chuckled, and I forced a smile, though my cheeks burned. Later that night, as I washed the dishes alone in their kitchen, I overheard Rebecca whispering to Marcus in the hallway, "Your mom doesn't fit in with our circle. She's sweet, but too simple. You need to prepare for the way people might judge us if she keeps showing up like this." My heart cracked, but I stayed silent. I told myself Marcus didn't mean it, that he was just caught between love and loyalty. But when he didn't defend me, when he let her words linger in the air unanswered, I knew something had changed. The little slights became bigger ones. My name was missing from the wedding program handed out to guests. Instead of mother of the groom, the line was simply blank. When I asked about it, Marcus said, "It's not a big deal, Mom. Don't make everything into drama." Then came the rehearsal dinner. I arrived early, eager to help. I wore my nicest shoes and carried a tray of homemade pies recipes passed down from my mother. But when I walked in, Rebecca frowned. "Oh, that's cute, but we already have catering. Maybe you can just put those in the back." She motioned to the kitchen without even tasting one. I felt invisible. My pies, my love baked into them, shoved aside as if they were trash. The final blow came just days before the wedding. I received a message from Rebecca's maid of honor, not from my son. It read, "Rebecca asked me to remind you to dress appropriately. Neutral colors, only, nothing flashy. We don't want distractions." I stared at the words until they blurred. Distractions. That's what I had become in my own son's life, a problem to be managed, not a mother to be honored. And yet, despite every insult, every dismissal, I kept telling myself that things would be different on the wedding day. That when Marcus looked into my eyes, he would remember the nights I stayed up tending his fevers, the mornings I packed his lunches, the years I gave everything I had to see him succeed. I prayed silently that he would see me not as an embarrassment, not as a burden, but as the mother who had carried him through every storm. But as the wedding day approached, a gnawing fear settled in my stomach. Because deep down, I could feel it. My place in Marcus's new life was shrinking, and no matter how tightly I held on, they were pushing me further and further out. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, though my heart was heavy with unease. I stood in front of the mirror smoothing the wrinkles of my modest blue dress. It wasn't new or fashionable, but it was the best I could manage. I told myself over and over, "This is Marcus's day. Smile, hold your head high, and don't cause trouble." When I arrived at the grand hall, I could feel the weight of the stairs almost immediately. Rebecca's friends, polished and elegant in their designer gowns, glanced at me as though I were an intruder. I smiled politely, but my palms were damp and a knot formed in my stomach. I took my seat near the front, heart pounding with pride, as I watched Marcus walk down the aisle. For a moment, I forgot everything, the insults, the dismissals. He looked so handsome, so much like his father in his black tuxedo. My chest swelled with love. But then, as if the universe refused to allow me even that moment of peace, I saw Rebecca's eyes lock onto me. Her lips curled into a smirk, and she leaned toward Marcus, whispering something I couldn't hear. His expression darkened. The music faded as the officiant stepped forward, ready to begin the ceremony. That was when Marcus turned, his voice slicing through the silence. "Mom, you're embarrassing me. Leave now." The words echoed across the hall, bouncing off the high ceilings and crashing down on me like thunder. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The organist's hands froze on the keys. Even the photographer lowered his camera, caught off guard. I sat frozen, my eyes wide, my breath caught in my throat. Surely, I thought, surely he couldn't mean it. Surely my son wouldn't humiliate me like this. Not today, not in front of everyone. But his eyes, once filled with the warmth of childhood, were cold now, hardened by shame. He lifted his hand and pointed directly at the exit. I said, "Leave." A murmur spread among the guests. Some looked at me with pity, others with thinly veiled amusement, as if they had been expecting this. My ears burned as whispers darted around me like arrows. "She really doesn't belong here. I heard she didn't even help with the wedding. Look at that dress. What was she thinking?" Each comment was a knife twisting deeper into wounds that had already been carved long before this day. My vision blurred with tears. I tried to speak to defend myself, but my throat closed tight, refusing to let sound escape. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. The small purse clutched in my hands felt like the only anchor keeping me upright. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might give out right there in front of everyone. Rebecca's eyes glittered with triumph. Marcus turned his face away, unwilling to meet my gaze. The son I had sacrificed everything for, the boy I once carried on my hip, who used to cling to my neck and whisper, "Don't ever leave me." Mom was now the man shoving me out of his life with no more effort than brushing away a shadow. I walked slowly down the aisle, each step heavier than the last. The music had stopped completely. All I could hear was the clicking of my heels against the polished floor, echoing like funeral bells. Guests shifted in their seats, some averting their eyes, others leaning forward eagerly, as though my humiliation were entertainment. At the door I paused, my hand resting on the frame for balance. I turned slightly, just enough to see the scene I had once dreamed of, the flowers, the candles, the smiling faces, all now blurred by tears. And there at the center of it all stood my son, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed anywhere but on me. The pain was indescribable. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was betrayal, deep and final, as though every sacrifice I had ever made had been erased with a single gesture. I lowered my head and stepped outside, the heavy doors closing behind me with a thud that felt like the end of everything. The air outside was cooler, but it did nothing to ease the fire burning in my chest. I leaned against the stone wall of the hall, my breath shaky, my body trembling with humiliation. My son had cast me out of his wedding. For a moment, I thought of simply walking away, disappearing into the night, letting them have their perfect ceremony without me. But then my fingers brushed against the small purse clutched tightly to my side. Inside it lay a velvet box, small, unassuming, but carrying a weight heavier than gold. I opened it slowly, my eyes falling on the 2 rings resting within the Johnson family rings, passed down for 3 generations. David, my late husband, had pressed those rings into my hand on his hospital bed days before his heart failed. "Keep them safe, Gloria," he had whispered. "When Marcus finds the one he wants to spend his life with, make sure these rings bind them. They're not just jewelry, they're our legacy." And so I had kept them hidden away for years, polishing them every so often, waiting for the day my son would need them. Marcus and Rebecca never asked where the rings were coming from. They simply assumed it was handled. No one knew that without me there would be no rings, no symbol of unity to complete the ceremony. But that wasn't the only secret I carried. The truth was, nearly every detail of the wedding they boasted about, the flowers, the orchestra, even the deposit for the grand hall, had been paid with my money. Quietly behind the scenes, I had covered bills when Marcus's credit card maxed out, when Rebecca's family contribution fell short. They never asked where the money came from, and I never said. I wanted my son's day to be perfect, even if it drained me. Now, standing outside with tears drying on my cheeks, I realized the bitter irony. The very people who pushed me aside, who treated me as an embarrassment, were celebrating on the foundation of my sacrifices. Inside the hall, the music began again. The ceremony continued, my absence unacknowledged. But when the officiant asked for the rings, a hush swept through the room. Whispers grew as the maid of honor scrambled, checking her purse, glancing around in panic. Rebecca's face paled, her polished smile cracking. Marcus frowned, confusion dawning. Because the rings weren't there. They were with me. I could almost hear the chaos through the thick doors, guests murmuring, Rebecca hissing in anger, Marcus trying to maintain composure. The perfect picture they had tried so hard to paint was falling apart, stroke by stroke, because the one person they had cast aside held the most important piece of their ceremony. I straightened my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power return to me. They had forgotten who I was. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. But I still held the truth, the legacy, the very heart of this wedding in my hands, and they were about to find out. The moment I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped back into the hall, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed, eyes turned, and the whispers that had once mocked me were replaced by stunned silence. In my hand, I carried the small velvet box, its weight no longer a burden, but a shield. The officiant stood awkwardly at the altar. His script interrupted, his voice uncertain. We cannot proceed without the rings," he had just announced. Marcus's face was flushed red, his jaw tight as he glanced at Rebecca, who looked ready to explode. I walked slowly down the aisle, my heels clicking against the polished floor with measured confidence. The same walk that had felt like a march of shame minutes earlier now echoed with power. I stopped just short of the altar and lifted the box. "I believe you're looking for these," I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying to every corner of the hall. A ripple of gasps filled the room. Rebecca's eyes widened, her hands tightening around her bouquet until the stems nearly snapped. Marcus's mouth opened, then closed again, words failing him. These rings, I continued, opening the box to reveal the gleaming bands, were passed down from Marcus's father, who entrusted them to me before he died. He wanted them to bind this marriage, to carry our family's legacy forward. Without them, there is no ceremony. Rebecca stammered, Why are you holding them now?" "Because you told me to leave," I replied, my eyes never leaving my son's face. And I almost did. But then I remembered this wedding, this day. You claim as yours wouldn't exist without me. I turned slightly, addressing the guests. "The flowers you admire, the music you hear, even this beautiful hall, those were paid for by a mother who worked herself to the bone for years, who wanted nothing more than to see her son happy. I gave everything I had so that today could shine. And yet the same sun cast me out because I wasn't dressed in silk." The hall was utterly silent. I could see shame flicker across Marcus's features, though pride kept his mouth shut. Rebecca, however, broke. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, her voice shrill. "Marcus and I cut in sharply. "What have you given? What have you sacrificed when your credit cards ran dry? Who covered the bills? When you wanted the orchids imported? Who quietly signed the check? You think this day belongs to you, but it was built on my sweat, my labor, my sacrifices. You pretend never existed. Gasps and murmurs swelled among the guests. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked at me with newfound respect. Rebecca's face turned pale. Her lips pressed thin. Marcus finally spoke, his voice cracking under the weight of the truth. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" "Because a mother doesn't keep score," I said softly. "Because I wanted to believe my love alone was enough. But today you proved me wrong." I closed the box with a decisive snap. "You wanted me gone, Marcus. You wanted me invisible. Fine, here are your rings, but don't forget they symbolize a legacy you almost threw away, a legacy you nearly destroyed by shaming the very person who gave it to you." I placed the box on the altar and stepped back. The officiant looked uneasy, glancing between us, unsure if the ceremony should continue. The guests murmured louder, some glaring at Rebecca, others shaking their heads at Marcus. Rebecca's composure crumbled. She hissed at Marcus, "Do something." But Marcus stood frozen, torn between the woman he thought he loved and the mother he had just betrayed. Tears welled in his eyes as he finally whispered, I'm sorry, Mom." But the apology, though heartfelt, was too late. The wound was already carved deep. I lifted my chin and turned toward the exit. "I don't need your wedding to validate me. I have given enough. From this moment on, it's up to you to live with the choices you've made." The hall parted as I walked, silence heavy behind me. Rebecca's voice rose in anger, trying to salvage control, but it only made her sound desperate. Marcus didn't chase me. Perhaps he couldn't. As I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun bathed my face. The humiliation was still raw, but for the first time that day, I felt free. Free from the weight of being unappreciated, free from the endless sacrifices that went unseen. The rings, the money, the ceremony, those could all belong to Marcus and Rebecca now. But my dignity, that was mine again. In the days that followed, I thought often about what had happened. The shame of being cast out by my own son lingered, but so did the strength I felt when I stood up for myself. For years I believed that love meant silence, that sacrifice meant erasing myself for the sake of my child. But I learned that silence only teaches others to disregard you. I raised Marcus with everything I had, and though he lost his way, that doesn't erase my worth. Parents are not disposable once their children are grown. We are the roots that hold the tree steady, the foundation that makes the house stand. Without us, there is nothing. I don't know if Marcus and Rebecca's marriage will survive the cracks exposed on their wedding day. That is their burden to carry. What I do know is that I will never again allow myself to be treated as invisible. To anyone listening to my story, hear this: never be ashamed of the people who raised you. Clothes, money, appearances, none of that matters compared to the hands that carried you, the sacrifices that gave you life. If you cannot honor your parents, then no amount of wealth or beauty will make you honorable. Respect is not optional. Gratitude is not weakness. And dignity once reclaimed can never be taken away again.